Hey, good morning. It's good to be together to worship and continue talking about heaven and earth. One of the things Janine and I have been kind of reminiscing about, we've maybe felt a little nostalgic lately and kind of going over some of our memories. And we have some pretty big moments throughout our life that we kind of talked about and wanted to kind of see what God would do going forward. But one of those things was our time with foster care. So when we lived in Michigan, we fostered for almost 6 years. And we learned a lot in foster care. One of the things we learned is that you can go from excitement and idealism to within an hour being broken and in tears, okay? I learned that I'm not as resilient as I thought I was, but kids are. They're more resilient than I thought they were. I've also learned that I'm more impatient than I thought I was. I thought I had a lot more patience, but going through all of these things that are really stretching moments when we did foster care, it was a challenge. One of the other things that was challenging was to see things a little bit differently. Now, Janine and I fostered almost exclusively kids of color. And so we had to learn how to see things a little bit differently. One of my learnings was that they see the world through different eyes. And so we had to go through some trainings, some cultural sensitivity trainings, in order to kind of help their process being black kids in a white family. And at first, some of these trainings I went through, if I'm going to be honest, I thought, I'm not even sure this is necessary. But the more we spent with those kids, the more time we had with them, the more I realized it's imperative. And here's how I see it coming out. Our youngest daughter was our last foster child, and we adopted her out of the foster care system. And I've noticed a couple of the things that she does and says that makes this different, seeing through her eyes differently, and how much seeing herself represented in the world around her matters. We were at a coffee shop just yesterday, and there was another person that had the same color skin as she did, and she ran over to her, didn't know her, and sits with her and just starts talking. Right? Now, she's normally shy. If you've interacted with her, she might not give you the time of day. But this mattered to her. Other times we've been in public and she'll say, Mom, Dad, look, that person has brown skin like me. Yeah, you're right, she does. And it's important. Now, as we're watching, we might watch a fair amount of Netflix in our house. And on the kids' profiles, one of the things I've noticed that's fairly recent is that they have a new section called Representation Matters. And all of this starts coming together for me as I'm listening to my daughter say these things, watching her actions, and seeing this reflection in culture. What I'm understanding is representation actually really does matter. Seeing something like that helps my daughter feel like she can belong. Like there's a space for her in society. That's that representative that she sees that looks a little bit like her matters to her because it gives her a feeling of safety and of peace. Like maybe she's not the only one like herself. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, there's another way that I think representation is actually incredibly important. And it's a different type of representation. It's kind of a restorative type of representation. When I was going up through elementary school, I remember having friends. At that time of life when you're growing up and you're saying, hey, when I grow up, I want to be this. Sometimes I still say that. When I grow up, I want to be this or I want to be that. But when we were in elementary school, you would kind of identify what you want to be when you grow up. And I remember some of my friends saying, I want to be a police officer or I want to be a school teacher. And I'd look at them and even at a young age, I'm like scratching my head because they're probably the ones having the most run-ins with those kind of individuals. You want to be a police officer? Didn't you just get picked up last weekend? It baffled me, but now as I look back and I look at maybe some of the bits of their lives that they lived, I think I might be starting to put some pieces together. There are certain people that we have experiences with us that become a representation to us. So some of these friends that I had that had a lot of run-ins with the law early on wanted to be a law enforcement officer, not because they were called to account for their actions by law enforcement officers, but because those police officers, in the midst of breaking rules and in the midst of having to be disciplined, showed them time, grace, and patience the way that nobody else in their family was. They don't want to become police officers or teachers because they discipline them. They want to become teachers and police officers because they're the people who were gracious and cared for them when no one else would in the midst of doing their jobs. That kind of representation matters. Now, it gets me thinking, what if people had that same kind of experience with followers of Jesus? What if people had that same kind of experience with people in the midst of the chaos of their lives that can represent the peace and love of Jesus in the midst of it? And even though sometimes we get aligned with being rule enforcers or whatever else you want to add as a descriptor or a label to people who belong to the church, what if the experience people had with us was so gracious and so peaceful that they wanted to become like Jesus when they grow up? What if we were a representation of Jesus that made other people feel like they could belong and have space? I want to ask you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 with me this morning. As we talk about heaven and earth, as we talk about what it looks like for the kingdom to come now, there's something important for followers of Jesus. There's something that we have to grab hold of, something that we have to understand. And Paul, who writes the letter to the church of Corinth, says it really, really well. But it comes with a challenge. So let's read it. We're going to start 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16. We'll read through verse 20. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are, therefore, Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. There's something for us to grab hold of, and I think it's something incredibly important, something that will ask us to shift our understanding of both the church and what it means to be a Christian or a follower of Jesus. Paul is writing, he's writing to the church of Corinth. This is his second letter. He wrote a first one, and honestly, both of them need to be understood, at least in what Paul is addressing, in order to understand why all of this comes to a point for Paul. Paul is picking up on a lot of different things as he's teaching the church, but he's picking up things even from his first letter. One of the first things Paul addressed in the church of Corinth was he recognized that they were an incredibly gifted church. They had so much going on. When we think about things like spiritual gifts, the church in Corinth excelled. But they had some other things that weren't excelling so well. They had a lot of other things that Paul needed to come along and take them by the hand and say, hey, we got to talk about these things. These things are a little bit out of line. And one of the biggest things for Paul was a level of disunity. There was some conflict that was separating people in the church of Corinth. One of those conflicts was the divisions that were starting to come up around who people specifically were following in their discipleship. So some of the people in Corinth would say, we follow Paul. Some people would say, we follow Peter. Some people would say, we follow Jesus, which is a little bit funny because they're all supposed to be following Jesus, right? And so they were identifying themselves, and there were some schisms that were rising in the church because people were saying, well, this is who I'm in the pattern of, and this is who I'm in the pattern of, and they were at odds. They thought one was better than the other. And so Paul writes to address those things. The other kind of divide that was in the church was actually between the church of Corinth and Paul himself. They would say things to him like, you know what, your letters are really weighty, but your presence isn't quite as weighty. Just what everybody wants to hear, right? Like, hey, you seem like you're really intelligent on paper. And then I met you in person, and I'm not getting that same vibe. You're really bold in your writing, Paul. You're talking about bringing us to task and disciplining us, but when you come, you're not that intimidating. I'm pretty sure I could take you. And so Paul continues to write to the church of Corinth and developing his understanding of the work of Jesus and how it impacts these specific issues. And as he's developing the thought, he gets to this turning point, which we pick up in verse 16. It's a shift. It's the practical application of everything that Paul has talked about up to this point. It's practical because it's asking them to change how they view one another, how they view the world, how they even view Paul. And it's something that's meant to actually heal what's been divided. It's something that's meant to heal what has been a conflict and a source of contention in the midst of the church. That healing that Paul points to is the person of Jesus. And it matters greatly. It matters so much that Paul talks about the shift that it's had for him in his own life. In light of everything that Jesus has done, and he continues to talk about Jesus, he says, from now on we regard no one from a worldly point of view. He says, though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. So Paul at this point, he's not talking about the entire church viewing Jesus in a certain way. He's talking about his own understanding and those who were with him. And maybe he's talking about even the larger religious group that he belonged to, the Pharisees. But at one time, Paul was a persecutor of the church. Anybody who followed Jesus after Jesus' ascension to heaven, after his death, resurrection, and ascension, Paul was going after. He wanted to imprison them. He wanted to even potentially put them to death if that was allowed. He says, in that same vein of thinking, in that same phase of life, we used to view Jesus in a certain regard. We used to view him from a worldly perspective, Paul says. Now, the reason Paul is saying that is because when the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other divisions of the Jewish elite, the Jewish ruling party, the people who had the most influence in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, the faith of the Jewish people, they looked at Jesus and they saw all the amazing things he was doing, and they kind of brushed it off. They said, well, there's other sorcerers. You can look into the book of Acts and see that as the missionaries are going out, they encounter all sorts of other sorcerers who are doing incredible things, but they're not doing it in the name of God. They're doing even miraculous supernatural things, but it's drawing on other powerful forces. And so it would be easy for Paul and the other religious elite to look at that and say, this is just one of those things. In fact, we can see that in the Gospels because there were times where Jesus was accused of casting out a demon by the prince of demons, meaning he's using the power of Satan to drive out Satan. Paul says that's how we used to look at Jesus. We thought that's what he was doing. And then farther down at the end, when Jesus dies, we looked at that and we remembered the prophecy that the declaration of Scripture that anybody who has been hung on a tree is cursed. They're under a curse. They're being punished by God. They're being stricken from God. So Jesus couldn't possibly be who he said he is because this is all a punishment. He's a sham. He's a con artist. At best, he's drawing on the power of Satan, and he's been punished for it. That's what Paul is saying. When we used to view Jesus Christ, when we used to view the Messiah, that's how we viewed him from a worldly perspective. Paul is drawing on that sharp language, and he's saying, this is how we're viewing one another. We are viewing each other through this lens, through this criticism, through this negative attitude, through this skepticism toward one another, through a distrust. But Paul says, in light of everything that has gone on, everything that Jesus has done for us, everything he's given to us, we can't view one another that way. Even though we used to view Christ that way, we can't view one another that way. We have to look at people differently. There's been a change in us. There's been a change in us because of the work of Jesus. And because of that work, it changes how we view people. That's the first practical outworking for Paul in light of the conflict in the church, in light of their schism between the church and himself, and in light of the work of Jesus. He says, hey, the work of Jesus, the good news of the Messiah, changes how we view one another. It changes how we deal with one another. He says it's so radical. The change in us is so radical, it's actually like becoming a new creation. You see, in the beginning, God created everything. He created it in his image. It functioned the way it was supposed to function, but then sin entered in and it marred creation. So the outworking of the work and ministry of Jesus, the life of Jesus, his death and resurrection, is that it's recreating everything. And so those who follow him, Paul says, If anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. Anybody who follows Christ is part of this new creation project of Jesus. It's so stark in contrast that it's like an entirely different creation. And it's happening now. Paul says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. Now, again, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about heaven now and not yet. It's easy for us to conceive of new creation. It's easy for us to think about heaven in the future. It's harder for us to accept that reality now. Yet that's the emphasis that Paul places here. That's the emphasis that Paul puts on this understanding of the new creation. It's not just a future new creation. That will happen. There will be this ultimate reality that in the twinkling of an eye will be changed at the second coming of Jesus. Yet that work, in some way, somehow, changes our reality now. Paul isn't inventing something new. Paul is picking up on the very words of Jesus when he says that the kingdom has come now. And it stays and it grows and it's meant to change and shift and multiply. Paul says that works down to the very understanding of who we are as creatures, as creation. We're not just going to be new creatures, we are new creatures. We're not just going to be recreated and renewed, we are being renewed. In a sense, Paul is saying we are currently becoming who we will be. We're living into that reality now. It should shift and it should change things now. There's an immediacy to Paul's words. The old has gone, the new is here, it's now. In verse 18, Paul continues, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Paul lays the challenge out at the feet of the entire church that is divided and not getting along. They're doing incredible things, but Paul draws them back to the understanding that this work was never about what they could do. It wasn't about what they had capacity for or capability of or ability to accomplish, because the reconciliation, the most important thing that changes us from old to new, from future to now and future, is the work of God. It's always been him working toward us, him moving toward us. That's why Paul says all this is from God. This whole reconciliation thing, that's from God. He is the author. He is the originator, he is the mover, he is the changer. He created the first creation, and he's recreating the new creation. It's all from him. He always moves toward us. The most powerful one moves toward the weaker, which is going to matter in just a second as Paul starts to talk about ambassador roles. He says, all this is from God who has reconciled us to himself through Christ. That's the work that Jesus did. It's the work that he did in his living and in his dying. It's the work that was accomplished for us in the resurrection, so that just as we are identified with the death of Jesus, we might also be identified with the life of Jesus, both before death and in resurrection. This is all tied together as the work of God that he moves toward us. And Paul calls it the reconciliation. Now, when there's a broken relationship, there's two options. Well, there's more than two options, but I'm going to talk about two options. How about that? We can forgive somebody, okay, but forgiveness can be one-sided. You don't need to receive an apology from somebody in order to forgive them. You can simply forgive them. That helps you as a follower of Jesus, as a person. It brings you freedom, even though it might not really affect the relationship a whole lot. You see, when there's a broken relationship, the best possible outcome for that relationship is reconciliation. And reconciliation is more than forgiveness. Again, forgiveness can happen on the party, on one side of an argument, on one side of a conflict. But for reconciliation to happen, we need both sides of the party to come to the table. For reconciliation to happen, both sides of the disagreement need to lay aside the conflict and pursue peace. Here's the interesting thing. In our human relationships, that takes both sides, right? But when it comes to reconciliation with God, it's all on Him. It's not about how much we can do. It's not what we can earn. The reconciliation is all on God. Though it takes two parties in the worldly perspective, it takes one party on the heavenly perspective, and that party is not us. That person is not us. We cannot go to the Father. The Father had to come to us. We could not reconcile ourselves to the Father. We had to be reconciled to the Father. That peace had to be brought by somebody, and that somebody is not us. We couldn't. If we could, we already would have, and Jesus would not have been necessary. But this is the work of Christ. It's from God. It's for us. It's to us. He always moves toward us. But even more incredible than that, I think, is that though we couldn't move toward God for our own reconciliation, once we've been reconciled, something happens. That new creation project starts in us, and we're co-opted into the mission of God, and now that same reconciliation that we've received from God, we are now charged to bring out. So though we couldn't go and attain it for ourselves, we are messengers of that reconciliation that Jesus has done for us. That's what Paul says. All this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. We are called to the ministry of reconciliation. That thing we couldn't do when the old was here, we can do when the new is here. Not because we are as good as Jesus, but because we are viewed through the same lens as God views Jesus. So we're called into the ministry of reconciliation. We're called into the project of new creation in the world around us. In verse 19, Paul continues, this is the message of reconciliation that he's about to describe. That God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. That's the brokenness that we discussed. And He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. Verse 20, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making His appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. David Garland is a commentator and a biblical scholar, and he comments on reconciliation and the role of ambassador like this. Like Christ, a minister of reconciliation plunges into the midst of human tumult to bring harmony out of chaos, reconciliation out of estrangement, and love in the place of hate. That's how Garland describes the work of Christ in reconciling us to God. That's how he describes Christ as being an ambassador to us on God's behalf. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We have this understanding of what an ambassador is. We have political ambassadors, and our political ambassadors, they go to a different country or a different political system, and they represent the full weight and authority of the government to the new government. Right? So we kind of get that, and there is that in this, but there's something even more when we understand Paul's context and we understand what was going on for ambassadors at the time. You see, ambassadors were sent from one nation to another like ours are, but usually for a different reason. It wasn't just to negotiate a deal or to be a constant presence and have diplomatic relations with another country. It was more than that. It was usually in response to conquering or being conquered. Okay? There was a lot of that going on, especially at the time of Rome. They were the greatest superpower in the world that the world had known up to that point, covering lots of ground. And so what would happen as their territory was expanding is they wouldn't necessarily send an ambassador to that country. You see, when you're conquering a country, you don't send somebody that is going to negotiate terms of peace. You make that country desire terms of peace, and then you can send your ambassador. Okay? But still, that's not exactly what Paul has in mind, because most of the time, ambassadors were not sent from Rome to other countries. It was actually the reverse. In Paul's time, ambassadors were sent from the weaker nation to the stronger nation, because they understood what was going to happen. They understood what was going on politically. And so the weaker country sends an ambassador to the stronger country to negotiate terms of peace. In the case of Rome, a smaller country would send an ambassador to Rome and say, hey, we would love to be a part of your kingdom. It happened that way because Rome doesn't really need to negotiate anything. They can just send in the troops and take it. That's what Rome did. The Pax Romana was all about peace through conquest. It wasn't peace through negotiation. It wasn't peace through diplomacy. It was peace through conquest. So other nations would send their ambassadors to Rome to negotiate terms of peace before there was ever need for peace the Roman style. The interesting thing is there's a contrast here, and Paul brings it to a point. He brings it to a head with this terminology of ambassador. This whole time with reconciliation, Paul has been using these military and diplomatic terms that people would see echoed from Rome to the other nations, and now Paul brings this to the person of God, only it's different. You see, in God's kingdom, he doesn't conquer people. He doesn't wait for them to send the ambassador because that's impossible. He sends the ambassador to us. He doesn't pursue us through conquest. He pursues us through offers of peace and love. As David Garland points out, in the midst of our chaos, he sends an ambassador, an envoy of hope and peace. In the midst of our hate, he sends an ambassador or an envoy of love. That's the work of Christ. He is the envoy of love and peace in the midst of our chaos and hate. God's kingdom is different. It is in stark contrast to the power systems of the world. And friends, you and I are being called into that. We're being called into that understanding of what it means to be part of God's mission. Again, David Garland says this: God's purpose in sending Christ and his envoys has the same end: to put an end to hostilities and to bring about a reconciliation. God sends out envoys to continue to announce that now is the day of salvation and reconciliation. That's the role that God is giving the church. That's what we're seeing in the life and ministry of Paul. That Paul comes to a church that's divided and he says, don't you understand what God has done? Stop setting yourselves up against each other in power dynamics and start understanding that God set those very same power dynamics aside and sent his envoy to you. Now will you please get along with one another? God didn't wait for you to come and apologize. He moved toward you first by sending his ambassador. And now that you've accepted that, I have a charge for you, he says. Church, I have a charge for you. Be reconciled to God. That's what Paul says at the end of verse 20. Be reconciled to God. Wait a second, Paul. You're talking to Christians. Aren't they already reconciled to God? What I think Paul is pointing out is that even in our living as followers of Jesus, we can show where we're not yet fully reconciled to God. Not because the work of Jesus wasn't enough, but because there are bits of our lives that we haven't allowed the work of Jesus to touch yet. There are bits of our lives that we haven't completely submitted. There are bits of our lives that we haven't allowed the ambassador Jesus to come and speak peace to. There are still bits of chaos in us that have not had the representation of God's kingdom. So Paul urges, he implores them, be reconciled to God. And in the midst of that reconciliation, the church is sent out to reconcile. That's the mission we're given. That's the big viewpoint of all of this. Please catch it. The church is called to represent the peace of the kingdom to the world. I'll read that again. The church is called to represent the peace of the kingdom to the world. That's what all of this is about. That's what Paul is sending people out to. He says, I urge you, I implore you, be reconciled to Christ. And in the same vein, bring the message of reconciliation to others, to the entire world. This reconciliation, this peace. Peace is a big word in the Bible. Now we think of peace as lack of conflict, but that's not the biblical understanding if we go all the way back to the beginning. The biblical understanding of peace, the word for peace in the Old Testament is shalom. And shalom isn't about a lack of conflict. Shalom is about everything working the way it was intended to work. It's everything being set to right. The reconciliation that Jesus did was to address the breaking of shalom. And the message of reconciliation that the church represents to the world around us is the new shalom in Jesus. That though it was broken, it can be made new. Though it's hurt, it can be healed. Though there's hate, there can be love. Though there's chaos, there can be order. This is the good news of the kingdom that we are called as agents and ambassadors to represent. Now God is once again, through us, sending envoys to the world, as Garland points out. He's still sending his ambassadors in the pattern of Jesus. He's sending us as Christ's representatives, as his ambassadors, with the full backing of the government of heaven to represent his terms of peace because he doesn't want to conquer. He won't conquer. He has the ability to conquer, but he doesn't. He sends us out to the world with the message that all things can be set to right, all things can be brought to a state of shalom. That's what the kingdom is doing now. That's what new creation is now. That's what we're called to. That's what the church is. Now I want to give you 3 things to keep in mind as we go out this week. 3 things that representatives do. Representatives of Jesus look a certain way. They do certain things. They have certain attributes. The first one is that representatives view the world differently. Right? Verse 16 started out with Paul saying, we don't view each other. We don't view others from a worldly perspective anymore. We view others differently. We view people as new creations. So as representatives of Jesus, you and I have to view the world differently. And by the world differently, I mean we have to view others differently. I think it's so easy to sometimes come to Jesus, especially if you grew up in the church, to follow Jesus and assume that the work has been done for you, but it won't be done for other people. Like, Jesus won that for me, but that guy over there has a filthy mouth, and he's a little bit of a jerk, so Jesus, you can just pass him over. It's so easy to write people off. I do it all the time. Here's how I do it really subtly. Here's how I view people from a worldly perspective in my everyday life. I get my business and I get my agenda in front of me as the first and foremost important thing. And then I act accordingly. And when that is true, when that is my reality, everybody I encounter is an inconvenience at best. It happens most, hear this, in Costco. You're laughing because you've been there, all right? Costco can be a little bit of a mess. And we were just there this last week, and we were in the food court area, which is probably the worst of the chaos, okay? And so we had checked out. You're at the end of Costco, you might be a little bit tired. You might be a little bit fatigued. You've gotten what you came for. Now you're just waiting for the $1.50 hot dog, and then you're going to be on your way, right? And I was standing there and I was waiting for our pizza and hot dog because one of our children won't eat the pizza. And I'm looking at people and the Lord reminds me to view them differently. He reminded me that I have to view the world differently, not as inconveniences, not as obstacles in the way of my mission, but as something entirely different. And so this is what I did in between making my wife feel uncomfortable in public. I started looking at the people that were passing me by, and I asked God to give me his eyes for them. Not just as people that are broken, not even as sinful people in need of reconciliation, but as loved creatures of God. And I'll tell you what, when I slow down long enough to view the world differently like that, it works every single time. Anytime I'm in a group of people, I get a little bit anxious and I'm like, why are there so many people in this world? It's time for a good plague. Something needs to happen. Okay? But if I'm willing to think with a not worldly perspective, I can see them through the eyes and love of compassion, through the eyes of Jesus that did not consider equality with God something to be held onto, something to be grasped, but he laid it aside and took on the very form of a servant. And that's the mentality we're supposed to have with one another. So what I want to ask you to do first and foremost as a representative of Jesus this week is to lay aside your agenda just for a few moments wherever you are in the midst of chaos and ask God to allow you to see the people around you with his love and compassion. It won't take long, I promise. You can look at them, watch them go by, and don't see the chaos. See the room filled with images of God that he can't wait to grab hold of, that he can't wait to transform in the blink of an eye into the new creation, that are so significant and valuable that he pulled out all the stops to rescue them and to reconcile them to himself, not waiting for us to come to him. Would you change how you view people? Would you change your view from mistrust to trust, from skepticism to honor, from inconvenience to blessing, from in the way to loved? Can we make that shift first? Just practice it this week. Wherever you go in the grocery store, don't think about people being in your way. Think about them as beloved of God. That's the first thing ambassadors do. That's the first thing representatives do. The next thing representatives do is they are being reconciled to God. Representatives are continually being reconciled. That's what Paul commands the church. He says, hey, I'm a representative of God to you, and I'm urging you, I'm imploring you, be reconciled to God. One of the things that is a regular pattern of a representative of Jesus, and that is synonymous right now with a disciple of Jesus, one of the things that is an everyday pattern for a disciple of Jesus is constant repentance. It's constant reconciliation. It's constant, it's constant response to the work of Jesus in our lives. You see, there are places of our lives that if we're paying attention in our actions, in our thoughts, in our desires, that are not yet reconciled with God. And because God is loving, he'll continue to send his envoy who reminds us of everything Jesus has done. The Holy Spirit in us will continue to point us to truth. And it's our job to continue to respond. So Paul wouldn't just urge the church of Corinth to be reconciled to God, he would urge us, be reconciled to God. As disciples of Jesus, who are also representatives of Jesus, will you continue being reconciled in your mind and in your heart to God? Would you continue receiving the work Jesus has done? Because there's another truth in the midst of reconciliation, that sometimes we receive the gift of God the first time to be reconciled to God, and we consider it a one and done deal. And we say, thank you, God, I'll take it from here. And it's not far down the line until we find ourselves in a rut and in the midst of discouragement because we find ourselves once again trying to earn a space with God. But that's never how reconciliation worked. You were always reconciled to him. You didn't reconcile yourself. I didn't reconcile myself. It's the work of God. It's from him. Disciples, representatives are being reconciled each and every day. We're being renewed. We are the new creation, but we're becoming the new creation. And then finally, representatives do what Jesus did. Representatives do what Jesus did. We forgive like Jesus forgave. We have grace and mercy extended toward others because Jesus extended grace and mercy toward us, but it goes more than those character qualities that are being refined in us. If you see Jesus doing it in his life and in his ministry, guess what? That's what the church is called to do. It seems like a pretty big deal, right? But Jesus didn't do what he did because he's God. Jesus did what he did because he had the power of the Holy Spirit. And he calls us, his church, into that same pattern so that when people encounter you, they encounter a representative, an ambassador of heaven with the full backing of God's government behind them to do the things Jesus did. That means the only things that are conquered by the kingdom of God are the powers of darkness. We don't conquer people, we conquer the powers. You and I are sent out as ambassadors with the power of God and the word of God, if we think about last week, to proclaim the message of reconciliation and to do the things Jesus did. Now, before you get way ahead of me and you start thinking there's no way I can do any of that, you're right. You and I are going to be really, really bad at these things if we're just starting out. That's okay, because we are new creations, but we're also becoming new creations. You don't have to do it all right the first time. That's why last week, one of the things I wanted you to hold on to was that in order to operate in the power of the kingdom, you have to have humility. Because you and I are going to be really, really bad at these things at first. We're going to have a lot of failures at first. But as the powers of darkness grow in the world, and they will until Jesus returns, the church will be increasingly victorious in the power of the kingdom until he returns. Let yourself increase in the ability to do the things Jesus did, but you have to start somewhere. If you've never prayed for somebody for healing, give it a try. Let me restate that. If you've never prayed boldly for somebody to be healed, give it a try. If you've never tried to hear on behalf of somebody else from God, give it a try. If you've never tried serving when nobody can see you serving, give it a try. Do the things Jesus did. Let his character in you grow as you're reconciled to him and overflow in the world around us. That's who we're called to be. That's what the church is. Friends, this is our basic understanding. This is our basic definition of discipleship. Becoming like Jesus and doing the things Jesus did. That's what a disciple is. That's what a representative is. Becoming like Jesus and doing the things Jesus did in the world around us. Friends, we can shift our view of the world around us. We can be reconciled to Jesus because he moves toward us. And we can do the things Jesus did because he has put the same spirit of power in you that rose God from the dead. Let's go out in that understanding this week. Understand that wherever you go, you are a representative of Jesus. People are not inconveniences. They are image bearers of God waiting to be restored. You are part of that restoration plan. I am part of that restoration plan. Let's live into it this week. Let's pray.